What's going on, family? This is Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. We're going to continue our conversation with 100 years of world championship fights. We're going to take a look at the bare knuckle era. You see, boxing has been credited for being around since 1681. But boxing was not the only art form in history. There were many art forms, and those differences were settled from the beginning of time. Here you're looking at BC, two men who are using citrus gloves. There were twine that was wrapped up around the phalanges and the wrists. They were glued with metal, glass, sharp rocks, and bronze. It could disfigure a man's face with one blow. This is how their differences were settled. No one ever survived a combat like this. Here you have two Indians solving their differences. But in this case, they are slaves. The man with the white coat and pipe in his mouth has wages on the man on the ground. Man next to him, the Confederate Civil War soldier, had his money on the man on top. And these men were selected to settle differences on behalf of those two men. The prize would be a horse with a young, beautiful Indian bride, perhaps buffalo. Rest assured, it would be the land of the Indians. Here you see a man with his knee on the groin, and he will be smashing the man on the ground's face to submission. He had the other hand on his throat, ready to choke him out. Yes, there were many ways of solving their differences. Here you see the hair pulling and a kicking of the groin. They would knee each other in the face, smash each other with elbows, get each other on an armbar until the death. Here you have two cavalrymen standing on top of whiskey barrels. Now, if the first man who fell off the top of a whiskey barrel would be the loser, he could end his life by breaking his neck. And he would also lose the whiskey barrel, which was worth a lot of money during those days. See, during that time, men normally didn't walk out of those square circles alive. They were different men. There was different reasons for them being in there. They didn't just lose money. They lost their pride. They would lose their land. They would lose ownership of whatever was on the line. As you can see here, one man is eye gouging the other man. The other man is placing a man in a chokehold. One of those men most likely will not get out of that square circle alive. Now, one of the most respectful and recognizable figures out of England was a swordsman. His name was Jim Figs. He was so respected, he was considered the heavyweight champion. From 1719 to 1730, he ruled the game. But he had a protege by the name of John Brockton. John Brockton was a fighter, pretty decent one at that. But he killed a man. And his subconscious mind led him to want to make the sport better. So one night on his cold floor, one hand he would have a lantern, the other hand a feather ink pen. He would write down some rules. It would be considered the Marquis of Queensberry rules. Many of them were rules that were made for the time. And it was called Mr. Boxing's 7 Boxing Rules of 1743. When a fighter has fallen, he is to be brought over to the chalk squared line. It will be 3 feet away from his corner. Man must return to the side of the chalk squared ring within 30 seconds of the time he fell. So not only did he have to get up on his own, but he would have to make it over to the white chalk line. No champion would be considered unless one man is left standing. And there's many rules that were jotted down by John Boxing, but only 7 would stick. Men were still dying. So then came a young man by the name of John Graham Chambers, born 1843 in Wales, and he died 1883 in Wales. He attended the Magdalene College of Cambridge. 1866, he founded the Amateur Athletic Club. In 1867, he created the 12 rules to govern boxing. It would devise the Marquis of Queensberry rules. He came up with the Fair Stand-Up Act. Man had to be allowed to get up and continue. In this case, he had 10 seconds to arise. No wrestling or hugging. 3-minute rounds, 1 minute in between. 10-second count for the fallen fighter. Man who knocked him down had to walk over to his corner. No seconds allowed in the ring during the rounds. There was a time where you have up to 12 men per corner in the ring while the men were fighting. And this was causing confusion because no one knew who would give one of the fighters a fistful of sand to rub into a man's eyes. They didn't know what foreign objects came from what hand to disfigure an opponent. So that rule went out the window. The man fell down and he got up. The corner could walk over to the man, carry him to his corner. That went out the window. Referee would decide time and place where a bout would continue. In case of interference, you see, boxing was illegal in 38 states. So in case cops got wind of where the action would take place, referee would be the only individual in that square circle who would decide time and place where that fight would continue. Now, obviously, the seconds would have to be involved in that conversation, but the referee would make the final decision. And because it was illegal, they would have fights in deserted ships, in caves, backwoods, and sometimes knee-deep water. And the interested spectators, as you can see in this foreground, sometimes would be sitting in trees, high rocks, and sometimes they would be in knee-deep water just to watch the action, because this was something they could not miss. Any broken or torn glove must be replaced. Man down on one knee is considered a knockdown. If a man is slouched over the ropes and his foot is off the ground, he is considered knocked down and must be counted. No boots or shoes allowed with springs. A man is allowed to have spikes in the bottom of the sole of his shoes, 2 in the back of the heel, and 1 under his toe. You had to fight on turf or red clay. Too many men were being picked up by the waistline and body slammed head first into the red clay. They were being DDT'd and armbarred. They'd be kneed to the face, choked out, eye gouged, hair pulling. That was no more under these new set of rules. The London prize ring rules would be engaged as another effort to clean up this game of boxing. We would have a scratch line, and in that scratch line was where both men would participate at the beginning of a fight. You see, the word start from scratch came from boxing. It was a line that was drawn in the center of the ring. If a man would fall during the course of a fight, must make it on his feet. He could be brought over to the scratch line, and the action would not resume. It would start over. And that's when they created the rounds. And that's where the word start from scratch would come from. To start over. To begin again. Now, if you didn't knock a man down, the fight can go for 5, 6, 7 hours. Once a man was down, and he was able to make it back to the scratch, new round would begin. So when you see 80 rounds, 90 rounds, that's the reason why. Now, the high stakes would also come from boxing. Because what that was a bag of money that was placed by the highest stake. You would have 4 stakes with ropes around it. The referee, when a fight would begin, would hand out 2 separate colors. And the corner could choose which color that he wanted. Place that color in the center of the stake. Whoever was winning the matches, the bag of money would go to the highest stake. And that's where the word high stakes would come from. The man who won would take the colored handkerchief and the bag of money. And he would place that handkerchief on his belt line, and that would signal he would be the winner. Now, if a man fell down, and it looked like he was taking a bad beating, the corner can throw a sponge, not a rag at the time, not a towel, but a sponge, and he would have to literally hit the fighter in order for the fight to stop. Otherwise, man can continue pungeling him until submission. If the fight would pass daylight, referee would decide when and where they would fight next. As for James Figs, was born 1684 in Thame, Oxfordshire. He died December 7th, 1734. He was a master swordsman. He was a well-respected bare-knuckle champion from 1719 to 1730. He had 271 fights without a defeat. He was the first heavyweight champion, and he was from England. Now you would have Jack Slack, who was born in Norfolk, Virginia, stood 5 foot 8.5 inches, he weighed 202 pounds. He was the 4th heavyweight champion. From April 10, 1810, became the heavyweight champion when he defeated John Brockton, who was the protege of James Figs. Jim Mace was called the Gypsy, who was born April 8, 1831, Norfolk, England. November 30th, 1910, he stood 5 foot 9.5 inches. He weighed 136 to 175 pounds. Was in the Hall of Fame 1954, International Boxing Hall of Fame 1990. He was in the ring with Tom Sawyer and Tom Protz. Fought Protz in 1851. Tom Harvey, November 12, 1852. He was in the ring with Joe Gauss 3 times. Joe Gauss was a bare knuckle champion and would lose his crown to Paddy Ryan. He was a fighter by the name of Tom King. He was born August 11th, 1835 in London. Weighed 175 pounds and stood 6 foot 2 inches. November 26, 1862. He would win a championship belt from Jim Mace. Bill Richmond was born August 5th, 1763. He died December 28, 1829. He was the first American fighter in history. He was the first American trainer in history. And the man he trained, name was Tom Molyneux. Tom Molyneux was born March 23rd, 1784. He was from Virginia. He died August 4th, 1818. Galway, Ireland. Stood 5 foot 8 inches. He was a heavyweight. Fought Tom Cribb December 18th, 1810. Cope Hall, Common, England. 55 minutes. Lasted 33 rounds. One of the most unjustest fights in history. See, Tom Molyneux had knocked out Tom Cribb rounds before. And unfortunately, Tom Cribb had 13 men in his camp, and they all jumped in. And they knocked down Tom Molyneux, stepping on his hand, crushing his hand. And to the point where Tom Molyneux would ball up his fists because he was in pain. And they would lie to the establishment stating that Tom Molyneux had metal pellets in his hand. And Tom Molyneux, when he tried to get up and protest, he was hit in the back of the head with an iron pipe. And this would allow Tom Cribb time to recover. With the broken hand that Tom Molyneux would have, he would not be able to defend himself. You see, he was originally a mixed martial artist, if you will, the way he fought. And he was trained by Bill Richmond, who was a good boxer. He couldn't even go back to what he knew best, was to at least grab his man. He was in such agony. And he certainly couldn't outbox Tom Cribb. So Tom Cribb would outlast him 33 rounds. Fight would be over. And Tom Cribb would get it was called the Medal Cup. Tom Cribb was born July 8th, 1781, England. Died May 11th, 1848. In Woolwich, London, England. He stood 5 foot 10 inches. He weighed 185 to 199 pounds. He fought both Bill Richmond and Tom Molyneux. Now, Bill Richmond weighed 145 pounds. In today's standards, that would be considered a welterweight. Tom Molyneux weighed 170 pounds. In today's standard, that would be considered a light heavyweight. He had a Jewish fighter by the name of Daniel Mendoza. Born July 5th, 1764. Applegate, London, England. He died September 3rd, 1836. He was 5 foot 7 inches and he weighed 160 pounds. 1792, 1795, he would be champion. Had great fights with Richard Humphreys, 1788, 1789, and 1790. Very good fighter was Daniel Mendoza. Small for his weight division. He was actually a middleweight. But he was an outstanding boxer. He was very mean and very aggressive. Didn't matter who he fought. He took on the best of them. Very good fighter was Daniel Mendoza. November 13th, 1886. Paddy Ryan would be knocked out by John L. Sullivan. 3 rounds, San Francisco. What a fight that was. John O'Sullivan would face Charlie Mitchell, March 10th, 1888. 4-1 odds. Ended in 39 rounds. Pouring rain. Both men were black and blue. John O'Sullivan had a smashed hand. And his knuckles and metacarpals would be skinned all the way to the bone. and all you saw was the white meat of his skin. Flesh. He would be crawling back, hands on knees, both men at the same time, vomiting on their way back. It was one of the most brutal contests in heavyweight championship bare knuckle history. And the way you can end a fight is if both men agreed, and it would be considered a no contest. But John O'Sullivan would have none of it. John O'Sullivan was something else. Now, Peter Jackson, who was known as the Black Prince, would be in the ring with James Corbett, California Athletic Club, San Francisco. Peter Jackson was known as the Black Prince. He was the Australian heavyweight and colored heavyweight champion. John O'Sullivan would defeat Paddy Ryan, February 7th, 1882. It was a $5,000 side bet. Bare knuckle championship was on the line. It was at the Barnes Hotel in Mississippi. Gentleman Jim Corbett would be in the ring with Charlie Mitchell, January 25th, 1894. It was at Duval Athletic Club in Jacksonville, Florida. It would end in 3 rounds. Charlie Mitchell never looked the same. He was a bloody mess, broken jaw, broken eye socket. James J. Corbett was born September 1st, 1866 in San Francisco, California. He stood 6'1". He was a heavyweight and a former bank teller. Fought from 1885 to 1903. Was in a ring with fighters such as Jack Berkey and Dave Campbell, Joe Choinski, and Jake Kilrain. When he fought Peter Jackson, it was May 21st, 1891. Now, Peter Jackson weighed 182 pounds. And gentleman Jim Corbett weighed 198 pounds. The high stakes were $8,000. To the winner, the loser would get $1,500. But it would wind up becoming 61-round draw. Both men would split $2,500. They would actually receive $2,500 apiece. And that referee was Hyman Cook, who would make that decision. And he made a decision based on the fact that John O'Sullivan had already drew the color line. There's no way in the world that Peter Jackson would get a shot at John O'Sullivan. And they thought that Peter Jackson would give out because they thought black fighters couldn't stand the heat. But they were wrong. And it was Jim Corbett who was fading out. And they just called it a draw. July 8th, 1899, Richburg, Mississippi. John O'Sullivan weighed 198 pounds. He was 30 years of age. Jake Kilrain weighed 195 pounds. He was 30 years as well. Fight went 75 rounds. The referee was John Fitzpatrick. It would be the last bare knuckle fight. Started at 8 a.m. and it continued when it stopped until 10 a.m. And then it picked up from 10 a.m. until no one can continue fighting. Over 100-degree heat. See, 38 states would not recognize boxing as a legal sport. And the governor, Robert Howey, will send out a reward for $1,500 for whoever turns in as a John O'Sullivan or Jake Kilrain. He had 3,000 spectators in the crowd. Both men were unrecognizable. Jake Kilrain was vomiting on the way back to his corner, as was John O'Sullivan. They say Jake Kilrain was unrecognizable by his own family. Another one of the most brutal contests in bare knuckle history. But that would be the very last bare knuckle fight in heavyweight history. September 7th, 1892, New Orleans, James J. Corbett weighed 178 pounds. He was 26 years of age. He defeated the 33-year-old John O'Sullivan. John O'Sullivan weighed 212 pounds. It went 21 rounds. And the referee, John Duffy, had called a halt when John O'Sullivan had fell face first. After the 21st round, he could not continue. See, when he wasn't fighting, he would be drinking. He would blow up to 280 pounds. And he took Corbett lightly. See, he sparred with Corbett a few months before that fight. But John O'Sullivan always had poor footwork. He didn't have any footwork, as a matter of fact. Gentleman Jim Corbett did. I'm sorry, John O'Sullivan didn't have any footwork. Corbett did. He was considered the dancing master. And he danced circles around John O'Sullivan. It was a winner-take-all. John O'Sullivan wouldn't make a dime. March 17th, 1897, Carson City, Nevada. 34-year-old Bob Fitzsimmons weighed 167 pounds. He defeated 30-year-old James J. Corbett. Corbett weighed 183 pounds. Referee was George Silver. And the fight was stopped in 14 rounds with the famous solar plexus punch. See, Bob Fitzsimmons was a very strong, very powerful man. He was a middleweight champion. He was a light heavyweight champion. And now heavyweight champion of the world. It was just recently when Roy Jones would be the only man to tie and break his record. June 9th, 1899, Coney Island, New York. James J. Jeffries, the Boilermaker, weighed 206 pounds. He knocks out 37-year-old, 167-pound former middleweight, former light heavyweight, and at the time current heavyweight champion, Bob Fitzsimmons. Stopped him in the 11th round. Referee was once again George Silver. The longest fight in boxing history began April 6, 1893, 7:17 p.m. to April 7th, 1893, 3:45 a.m. in the morning. 129-pound Andy Bowen versus 130-pound Jake Berkey. Went 110 rounds, 7.5 hours, 19 minutes. It was a glove contest. Andy Bowen, born May 3rd, 1862, New Orleans, Louisiana, was in his hometown. He died December 15th, 1894, New Orleans. He was 27 years of age at the time of his death. He had a fighting career record of 27 total bouts, 16 wins, 7 knockouts, 3 losses, 7 draws, and 1 no decision. Began boxing at the age of 20. It was a natural for him. He was a short, stocky young man with a very high temper. And he was supposed to fight another man, which is ironic. But Jack Berkey was born January 1st, 1869, Chicago, Illinois. He died October 25th, 1913, was 44 years of age at the time of his death. He had a fighting career record of 12 fights, 5 wins, 4 losses, 3 draws, and 1 no contest. She was 8,500 spectators that came to see this fight. It was a lightweight title of the South. It was at the Olympic Club in New Orleans. And Berkeley had broke both wrists in round 51. And what was odd about this fight was that Bowen was not supposed to be in that ring. He was the actual manager and trainer of Shy Jackson. And Shy Jackson got cold feet. And the side bet was already in the hands of the referee. So Andy Bowen decided to put on a pair of gloves and step in. No training involved. But yet he was able to go 110 rounds. A brutal contest. Those who came to see the fight, 8,500 spectators. Many of them went home to go eat, came back, went home to eat breakfast, and came back when they were still fighting. Many of them were sleeping on the ground. And it got to a point where these men were wobbling, crawling back to their corners. They laid down to take a rest. They were woken back up to continue the fight. It was the longest fighting contest in boxing history. The sad story about Andy Bowen fought an 85-round bout in his next fight against Jack Everhand. And then he was killed by George Kid Lavin. He got hit and cracked his jaw, landed on the ground head first, and cracked his skull. When he won 85 rounds in his next fight, before he was killed, it went 4 hours and 30 minutes, and he broke his left hand. What a fighter, what a warrior was Andy Bowen. December 19th, 1887, Spine River in Paris. Jake Kilrain and Jim Smith. Jake Kilrain was born February 9th, 1859, Greenpoint, New York. He died December 22nd, 1937, Quincy, Massachusetts. Stood 5 foot 10 and a half inches. He weighed 175 pounds, up to 230 pounds. The fight was a 106 round draw. 1887. And what was odd about this was that John O'Sullivan was supposed to have that fight. He wasn't in shape, and he didn't have the $5,000 side bet. So steps in is Jim Smith. Jim Smith was the England heavyweight champion. He was born January 21st, 1863, London, England. He died September 10th, 1931, in London. He stood 5 foot 8 and a half inches. He weighed 170 to 212 pounds. He was managed by Frank Green. He was a stocky, brawling wrestler. He won 140 to 154 pound competition in London. Sometimes he wore gloves, sometimes he was bare knuckle. But this particular fight was for the Police Gazette heavyweight championship belt. December 16th, 1885. Jim Smith